Goedemiddag bij de vaste commissie voor Financiën. En we hebben vandaag het gesprek met de voormalige National Taxpayer Advocate uit de VS, mevrouw Olson. And I will change to English. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting today between the members of the Permanent Committee on Finance. We have Mr. Romke de Jong from Democrats 66, Mrs. Inge van Dijk from the Christian Democrats, Mr. Idsinga from the Liberal Party, and Mr. Omtzigt from Group. Omtzigt. And of course we have, and we have the representatives of the former American Taxpayers Advocate, Mrs. Olson. Welcome. Firstly, a warm welcome to Mrs. Olson and to Mr. Arnaud Booij, member of the board of the Dutch Association for Fiscal Mediation, and to Mr. Jurgen de Vries, member of the board of the Dutch Association for Taxpayers, for being here today. Of course, also welcome to the public and the people, of course, who are following this from home, from the live stream. I propose we do a very short introduction and then we go very quickly to the question. Mrs. Olson, the way of working is, okay, mention the questions from our MPs and then we will start the discussion. Mrs. Olson, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Nina Olson. From 2001 to 2019, I was the National Taxpayer Advocate of the United States in the Internal Revenue Service, our tax agency. And I led an organization of about 2,000 employees who helped taxpayers solve their problems with the IRS and identify the administrative and legislative causes of those problems, and then make recommendations, administrative and legislative recommendations, to both the IRS, the Secretary Treasury, and Congress on how to mitigate, lessen those problems. After I retired from the IRS in 2019, I founded an NGO, the Center for Taxpayer Rights, in which, as I've said to others, I took all the fun parts of my former job and took them with me and left behind all the bureaucratic parts like employees and things like that. So that's where I am today, continuing to work on protection of taxpayer rights.
Thank you, Mr. Olson, for the short introduction. Mr. de Vries, the short introduction, and then Mr. de Booij, and then we go to the questions. We have an informal talk, so...
Thank you. Like you already introduced me, I'm the chair of the Dutch Taxpayers Association, Bond voor Belastingbetalers.
Mr. Booij.
I'm a tax advocate, a fiscal advocate, and I'm attached to the University of Leiden as a lecturer, and I'm the chairman of the Association for Tax Mediation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the questions. Let's do one question each, and then we quickly can go to the, or not, to the second round. Mr. Romke de Jong, D66.
Yes, thank you very much. And Ms. Olson, very happy to have you and very happy that you wanted to be here with us. Of course, the agency you've ran since between 2011 and 2019 is now a cornerstone in how people in the USA look to taxpaying. But I was wondering, how did the agency evolve between 2011 and 2019? It's a big term, and I can imagine that the organization changed in all those years. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Shall we do the inventarization of the first 4 questions, and then we come back? Mrs. Olson, do you want to have a cup of tea or coffee?
I'm fine.
Fine? Okay. Then I go to Mrs. Inge van Dijk from the Christian Democrats.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And I've got a question. Can you tell us a little more about the positioning of the taxpayer advocate within the IRS? What advantage does it bring and what disadvantage?
Thank you, Mr. van Dijk. Mr. Idsinga from the Liberal Party.
Yes, thank you first of all for being with us today. It's very special to have you. I have a lot of questions, but let me start with one. We now have the opportunity to introduce a taxpayers advocate service. So that means that we have the opportunity to do it right from the start. But of course, we can make mistakes, and it's our job to control the government. So, and they have to implement it in the first place. So, what would you recommend to us with your wide experience over the past years? What would you recommend to us? What are the right questions to put to the government? What are the do's? What are the don'ts to make this a success? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Idsinga. Mr. Omtzigt.
I would like to do a small follow-up of the question of Mr. Idsinga. One of the big dangers if you set up an agency and you ask the government to set up an agency, there may be a tendency of the government to have certain mechanisms in there in which they can influence that agency, either the budget or by giving direct instructions or whatever. What were the main ways in which you had to keep your independence from government, and what were the ways that was guaranteed under American law?
Okay, that was the kick-off.
That's great.
Mr. Olson.
Okay. I think I can answer your questions by starting with a little bit of a history of the position and how it evolved. And in fact, my term, it wasn't a term, but I was the National Taxpayer Advocate for 18 years, so from 2001 to 2019. Talking about making mistakes, the position first came into place as a taxpayer ombudsman in 1970. And the IRS itself created it in response to Congress and taxpayers being very angry with the way the IRS was treating them. I hope that sounds familiar, you know. And the agency thought creating this position to help where taxpayers could come would give them some help somewhere. But the position was filled by a career civil servant, someone who had grown up in the IRS. So by 1988, Congress adopted that position in law, put it into law that there would be a taxpayer ombudsman, and it's a statute in the Internal Revenue Code. They wanted the taxpayer ombudsman to report to them about the problems taxpayers were experiencing, but it was still a career civil servant inside the IRS, and reporting somewhat low down in the agency, not to the commissioner, but we have a commissioner of IRS and then a secretary of Treasury that the commissioner reports to, and then the president. But the taxpayer ombudsman reported to a deputy or something. In 1996, Congress was beginning to hear from its constituents that the IRS was treating taxpayers poorly, both individuals, small businesses, self-employed. And they created a commission to go around the country and hold public hearings about how IRS was treating taxpayers and what could be done to improve it. And in 1998, they held a whole series of hearings in Washington, D.C., and heard from a lot of different people, including myself at the time, about how to improve IRS operations. And one of the things that they asked about was how to improve the taxpayer advocate, because it was not viewed as independent. Prior to that, they had actually changed the law to say, you're no longer a taxpayer ombudsman, you are a taxpayer advocate, trying to say we want you to advocate for taxpayers before the IRS. But even so, they felt that it wasn't happening. So in 1998, they created the office that I held for 19 years. And they did a number of things to make it independent and still effective, but it wasn't easy. So part of what I'm saying is it took a while to get to the right answer. First thing that they did was they said the taxpayer advocate is inside the IRS. The taxpayer advocate reports to the Commissioner of Internal Revenue Service. But the commissioner's boss, the Secretary of the Treasury, hires the National Taxpayer Advocate, appoints the National Taxpayer Advocate, and can fire the taxpayer advocate. The commissioner cannot. So if the taxpayer advocate is doing their job and doing proper oversight of the IRS and the commissioner gets upset, it's not the commissioner who can make the taxpayer advocate fired. It's only the secretary. So there's a safety valve in there that says, no, we're not going to, get rid of this person. They're doing their job. That was one aspect of independence. The second thing is, I have to say, the taxpayer advocate is a creature of Congress. Congress created this position. And they really wanted the taxpayer advocate not only to help the taxpayers who were the voters of the United States, but also help it do its oversight responsibility for the IRS. And so another form of the independence was that it required the taxpayer advocate, even though you're an employee of the executive branch and you report to the Commissioner of Internal Revenue Service and you're a direct report, you can't be buried in the organization by law, is that they told the taxpayer advocate that you have to provide 2 reports to Congress a year. And those reports go directly to Congress, and no employee of the IRS, no employee of Treasury, no employee of the White House can see that report until you deliver it directly to Congress, so that there'd be no censorship in what we were writing about. And it said in that report, you need to identify the most serious problems that taxpayers are experiencing with the IRS. You need to make administrative recommendations for how those problems could be, mediated, and also make legislative recommendations, because sometimes what the IRS is doing is caused by, the law is having unintended consequences. You enacted something, you didn't expect it to play out this way, the world changes. Is there something we need to do about the law? And, because we were able to see what was happening to taxpayers, we could make really practical, evidence-based recommendations. So the Congress also told in this law in 1998 the mission of the Taxpayer Advocate Service: help taxpayers solve their problems with the IRS. That's number one. Then, as I talked about before, identify the administrative causes of those problems and identify the legislative causes of those problems, and then make administrative and legislative recommendations to mitigate those problems. So the whole focus was, what is the taxpayer experience with the IRS? We were organized in 2 ways. One was, the law said that there are 50 states, there's 1 Puerto Rico territory, and there's the District of Columbia. So you have to have at least 1 office in each state. And so there were local taxpayer advocates that were based in the states so that you would know what was going on with the taxpayers on the ground. And that was very important because, as you asked about what was happening between 2001 and 2019, as budgets, were cut and you were trying to find efficiencies throughout government, offices were shrinking, and the IRS was becoming more and more centralized and further away from the taxpayers that it was supposed to serve. So the taxpayer advocate, being based, having at least 1 office in every single state, could understand the economic conditions in each state, could understand the demographic makeup of the state. If a state had a hurricane, you were there understanding what that meant to the taxpayers who were struggling to recover from the hurricane, who couldn't get their businesses on the ground, all those sorts of things. And so it really became, what we tried to build in those years was a grassroots organization that was connected to the taxpayers, to the representatives that were working in those areas, and really do outreach to educate taxpayers about their rights, their responsibilities, initiatives the IRS was doing, and then hear back from taxpayers what their issues were. And those local offices worked the cases that came in. So over my tenure, we had 4 million taxpayer cases come in. The United States has 160 million individual taxpayers and about 10 million corporate taxpayers. And we got, over that period, we would get about 250,000 cases a year. And that really told us what was happening with the IRS. How can someone come into our organization? The law said that taxpayers who are experiencing significant hardship, and you're going to explain that, significant hardship as a result of how the IRS was acting or not acting or about to act, then they would be able to come in to the IRS, to the Taxpayer Advocate Service.
Can I add?
Yes.
Yeah. In the Netherlands, we know something like the hardheidsclausule. That's a different thing than this hardship. That is broader. Because this part, the hardheidsclausule, is only focusing on the let's say the effects of a certain legislation and the purpose and what the Parliament would have, what the meaning was of that specific law. And this is much broader. It looks at the personal circumstances of the people and businesses as well.
I saw a short question for Mr. de Jong.
Well, I'm wondering, how did you ensure that the IRS would be able to correct like factual errors with no IRS or Treasury employees having seen the Tax Advocate Service reports?
That's a great question. So remember that we were inside the IRS, and I was a member of the senior leadership team of the IRS for 18 years. And so nothing got put into the report until we had worked it with the IRS thoroughly. If the IRS was doing an initiative, I had employees sitting on teams with other IRS employees working on it and speaking up as policies and procedures were being created, saying, wait a minute, this will harm taxpayers. If they ignored us, my employees would come to me, and then I would go to the head of that organization, or ultimately the commissioner, and say, I have concerns. If they ignored me, then that's when it would show up in the annual report to Congress, because we had tried to work it inside the building, but we didn't get the results that we wanted. And then we would have to tell Congress, this is what we did. These were our recommendations. The IRS was required by law to respond to our recommendations in writing once we put it in the report to Congress within 90 days. And that would be public. So Congress could see IRS's formal response to what we had to say. And sometimes we would get a very different response after publication in that 90-day period than what we got before. And sometimes that was because, people just thought we would go away, which we didn't. And sometimes it was... Yeah. And sometimes it was because maybe the wrong people, the issue didn't get elevated far enough to the right people, And when somebody finally saw it in the annual report to Congress, they thought, of course we'll do this, or we can do something about this. And I think that was very important, that we were really, really there as decisions were being made. The other thing that we had in these conversations with the IRS, again, were our cases. So even as we were trying to do what I call systemic advocacy, trying to fix a program, change guidance to employees so that there would be greater clarity for what employees could do or not do. Even as we were working those systemic issues, we had these cases where, if we were working on a particular program, our cases were coded. We had over 100 codes to be able to say, well, what's happening in this program? So we could actually pull cases that were affecting individual, small business, NGO taxpayers, it didn't matter, and see what was going wrong with the program. And going into those cases, you could actually find, oh, it's that guidance isn't clear enough. Oh, it's that they're not trained well enough. Oh, the procedure is too complicated for taxpayers to get it right. They don't understand what to do. And that would help us make recommendations. And when the agency came back to us and said, well, you don't have any evidence, we'd say, here are cases.
Thank you. I see a question, Mr. De Jong. Mrs. Van Dijk. Okay, Mr. De Jong.
Yeah, so I can imagine that there is a certain tension between your agency and the IRS. How would you describe that relationship at the time you left? You had this much experience, you said nearly 19 years, so I can imagine the relationship evolved, but how would you describe it?
Mrs. Olson.
That's a great, when I came in, I was the second National Taxpayer Advocate. The first one had stayed just for a year, and it was a very new position. And there was a lot of suspicion and wondering what this job was. And it took, I'd say, about 5 years for them to realize that we were actually trying to help them. And it took a while by getting, it took a while even just to get our employees on teams so that we could help them without being public. But once they started seeing that we were actually keeping them out of trouble by raising issues that they might have missed, I think they really felt that they needed to get our help. It also mattered how the commissioner viewed my job. I've worked under 5 commissioners, and some of them viewed me less favorably than others, let's just say that. But by that, the other thing is that we had built strong alliances in Congress. Congress really valued the work that we did. And the Secretary of the Treasury really valued the work that we did. It prevented problems, it prevented blow-ups. And so that support helped the agency, if not, embrace us with warm arms. They understood our value.
Thank you. Mrs. Van Dijk.
Thank you. I'm very interested in a taxpayer bill of rights. Can you tell us a little bit more about the creation of this document and how important it was?
So I had been looking at how do you get taxpayers to know that they have rights before the tax agency. And in fact, in the Internal Revenue Code in the US, we have a lot of taxpayer protections. But if you don't know that those protections exist, you're not going to use them, you're not going to claim them. And so I studied what OECD had come out. They had done a report in 1990 and a later one proposing 10 provisions of a charter or rights. So, in the United States, we have our Constitution and we have our Bill of Rights. And every American knows the Bill of Rights. They know that they have the right to free speech. They don't necessarily know what that means, that, there are limits on that right to free speech, but at least they will say, if somebody's trying to keep them quiet, wait, don't I have the right to free speech? And that starts the conversation. Yes, you do, or yes, you do, but not here. So I was trying to think, how can we organize something that will help taxpayers know to start the conversation? Don't I have the right to quality service? Don't I have the right to appeal your decision? Don't I have the right to privacy, to confidentiality? to a fair and just tax system, to representation, before the agency. And by coming up with those 10 rights, we then were able to put the statutory and administrative rights that existed in the Internal Revenue Code and in the IRS procedures, we could fit them under the 10 rights. So that, and on our website, we created a way for taxpayers to look up, do I have a right to an appeal? And then you could actually see in plain language the details of when you could get that right to appeal. But they would learn it in that way. And then we thought, if we can get this passed, we can also use it as a training tool for IRS employees. We can get them to think about their jobs in terms of how the things that we're asking them to do further those rights and further protections. So in collection, you need to think about the taxpayer's specific circumstances. Can they actually afford to pay this debt without not being able to pay basic living expenses? Are you creating economic hardship for this taxpayer such that they'll become a ward of the state, And so think about that as you're applying the law and your administrative responsibilities. And so we would put provisions in IRS employee guidance referencing the Taxpayer Bill of Rights and how to think about this task in reference to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights.
I see Mr. Idsinga for a question, then Mr. de Jong,
Yes.
and then Mr. Omtzigt. Mr. Idsinga.
Yeah, thank you for addressing my earlier question about critical success factors. It gives us the opportunity to bear them in mind and to learn from it. I have another additional question. If you because you have a lot of experience, and if you squeeze all these years together and look at it from a distance, what type of common themes, repetitive main themes, did you encounter? And do you expect them to be common for us as well? Likely they will be, I think. And also, how did you contribute to improvements?
I think all tax agencies and maybe all governments are struggling with information technology being so old that it limits you being able to do things that taxpayers expect from the people expect from the private sector. And the IRS has antiquated technology. And sometimes that really drives some of the ways that they interact with taxpayers. They also aren't attracting the best and brightest, employees because there's so much competition in the private sector. And I will also say that the IRS has been underfunded in areas for years, particularly on taxpayer service. Everyone thinks that by going digital, you don't need to have people answering the phones or people working face-to-face with taxpayers. But if you have a broad taxpayer base, you need some kind of human interaction in order to explain things to taxpayers, make sure they understand, et cetera. And so finding the right balance between automation and digital and human interaction is a challenge. One of the things that I did, several years, I made the IRS information technology the most serious problem facing taxpayers. And we really told the story of what was happening to taxpayers because the IRS's systems were so old. And like if a taxpayer called up and asked a question, the employee couldn't see in the system the taxpayer's return to be able to answer the question, which erodes faith in the, trust in the IRS. And it was purely a system issues that the systems don't talk to one another. And we told stories like that. And that meant that Congress gave IRS more funding, which made me a little bit more popular in the IRS. We highlighted the training of the IRS. We actually counted up the training hours that they were spending on IRS employees and showed that over the last 10 years, training had drastically dropped, which means employees weren't equipped to accurately get answers or give answers to taxpayers or do audits properly. They didn't understand the law. And so we were able to get Congress to push to change, to require the IRS in its appropriations to do more training and come up with a comprehensive training plan. And so there were things like that on a larger scale were really, I think, helpful for Congress to be able to see. And sometimes, the IRS employees were feeling it too, and were grateful that they were getting more training. It's embarrassing to them to not know how things are, and it affects morale. We did get lots more taxpayer rights legislation enacted. It takes a while, but in 2019, in July, my last month as National Taxpayer Advocate, Congress passed a major taxpayer rights bill that contained 21 of my legislative recommendations over the years. I viewed that as a farewell gift to me. But, it takes a while to get legislation passed. But it's worked through, what makes sense for the agency, what am I agreeing, it's a dialogue, and then Congress has the final say. But because they were able to see, we were providing transparency, and so they had more information to make decisions.
I first go to Mr. Omtzigt and I come back to Mr. de Jong. Mr. Omtzigt?
So you say you first need a bill to establish a National Taxpayer Advocate, and you do that by bill because we've had that kind of agencies which by bylaws, and that doesn't work very well, I can tell you. You had your own budget, I take it, which couldn't just be taken away by the government. And then you need another bill for the taxpayers' rights. That's the kind of constellation I get it, you need to get it working. Is there anything else I'm missing here?
Yes, I will talk about I will talk about the budget, and then I will talk about one aspect of the statute that created the office that I think is very powerful. The budget, interestingly, was not a separate budget. I did recommend we should have a separate budget, but it was not. So we were at the mercy of the IRS proposing it. But one year, one of the commissioners in 2005, I think, decided that he wanted to cut taxpayer service and cut the budget of the Taxpayer Advocate Service in order to put more money to enforcement. And that didn't sit well with members of Congress, and they called me up to testify, sitting next to the commissioner at a hearing about the commissioner's proposal to cut my budget. And from that point on, my budget was a separate line item in the IRS budget. So, you ask me how it evolves, that's how it evolves. The other thing that is in the statute, which is really important, when we would get a case from the taxpayer would find us, or IRS would refer the case to us, or members of Congress would refer us a case because they'd heard it from their constituents. So we would receive congressional cases. We would first we would do our research. So the first thing is we had access to IRS database systems. That's because we're inside the IRS. And I would say if you decide to place an agency outside the IRS, you have to make sure that they have the authority to get access and information to this case management systems, what's actually going on in the case, that there has to be, authority to get that information so you can really see how that case is being worked. And we had that access. So we would look at that case first, and we had the information that the taxpayer was saying, and then we would decide independently what we thought was the right answer. And we would talk to the taxpayer about that. Sometimes they didn't like our answer, but between 65 and 80% of the time, we got the relief the taxpayer was asking for. And about 13% of the cases, the law prevented relief. And sometimes out of those cases, we'd identify a need for a legislative fix. Other times the law seemed right, and it was just that we had to tell the taxpayer, we're sorry, but we think the law is right. This is the right result. We'll help you if you have a tax debt and you need to work out some other things, but this is what we can do for you. If we thought the taxpayer was right, we would then send over to the IRS function that was working the case and say, please look at the information we've gathered. Here's what we think you need to do with this. Get back to us quickly. So that was a pretty please. We were asking nicely for them to do something. We had negotiated agreements with every single function in the IRS for how quickly they were going to assign the case to someone and how quickly they were going to get back to us. And we had cases where economic hardship was happening. The IRS was actually itself doing nothing wrong, but something about the taxpayer circumstances meant that they were going to experience harm if the normal processes were followed. And so somebody had to move in quickly to prevent that harm. And in those cases, the agreement said, you're getting back to us, you're assigning it within 1 to 3 days, and you're going to tell us what you're doing in 5 to 7 days. We don't have time. And sometimes we'd say even faster if it was a real crisis. Then there were what we called systemic burden cases. The taxpayer had tried to work through the normal procedures. Maybe no one was listening to them. They couldn't find the right person. Maybe the IRS had no procedures to address this problem and they weren't willing to create procedures. Maybe the procedures weren't working as intended. In those cases, we wanted to make sure the taxpayer had tried the normal channels. We weren't a replacement for the normal channels, but where the normal channels weren't working, we would take the case in and get it to the right place. And there, it wasn't as much of an emergency, so we gave the IRS a little bit more time, but they still had to respond to us. If they didn't agree with us or they ignored us, we had the statutory authority to order the IRS to do something. And that was called the Taxpayer Assistance Order. And that's different from ombudsmen. They don't normally have that order, but we would order them. And the first thing that we would do is the frontline employee would elevate it to their manager in our organization, and that manager would walk over to the other organization's manager and say, look, can we have a conversation here? What's going on? Why won't you do? We think we're right. And if that manager refused, disagreed, or didn't convince us that we were wrong, then we would issue the order. And if that manager disagreed, it would be elevated up to the next level of manager to give the IRS a chance to get it right the next time or convince us otherwise. And if they didn't agree, it landed on my desk. So very quickly, it got to my level. And even if the IRS had 15 other management levels in between, I wasn't going through them. You get 2 chances down here, and then I'm going to send the order over to the head of the organization, because I believed the head of the organization needed to know what was going on down at the front line and why they weren't getting what we thought was the right answer. And when I issued that order, when the National Taxpayer Advocate issued that order, only the commissioner or the deputy commissioner of the IRS could overturn my order. And that made sense because I'm inside the IRS and they're the commissioner. But Congress said that when I submitted my report to Congress every year, I had to tell them about the orders that I had issued that the commissioner had not agreed with. We didn't disclose taxpayer names, but we were able to describe the circumstances. And so that gave Congress a chance to weigh in saying, what are you doing here? Why did you not want to give relief in this case? When it came all the way up to you. And so it was another way of giving Congress a window into the internal operations of the IRS, but also you are allowing work within the IRS, trying to get it right within the IRS before you went public. we didn't really issue very many taxpayer assistance orders because the threat of issuing a taxpayer assistance order was very effective. Nobody wanted their manager to know what they were doing. And so, you know, if we threatened it at the front line, often they said, well, oh, okay. We got the relief for that taxpayer. You know, we're going to have to wait for another day to get the systemic problem solved. But it was an important tool. And there were times that, you know, I directed my employees to sidestep that pretty please stage because we knew the IRS was just going to deny things. And we just went directly to the taxpayer assistance order and used it as a way to bring systemic change.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Mr. de Jong.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and I hope you give me the chance to give two questions, because I have one question, but this triggers another one, because I was intrigued by what you said, that you had 5 commissioners in the time you were taxpayers advocate. And you also said there were different opinions. So I was wondering how you kept this out of politics. You just gave an example how politics could influence and where there's a benefit. But what happens if politics interferes or has an opinion about your agency? That's one. The other question is the right to representation. So a big difference between here and the United States is that you can have an authorized representative, especially when you have a low-income taxpayer. We don't have that here. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how it affected those people who have nearly to none expertise on tax paying?
So I think what's really important about the Taxpayer Advocate Service is that it was viewed as a bipartisan organization. I was appointed by Secretary Larry Summers under President Clinton 8 days before the Clinton administration ended. I showed up for work on March 1st of 2001 under President Bush and Secretary O'Neill. So I was appointed by a Democratic president as secretary, and I showed up to work under a Republican president and secretary. And that went back and forth, you know, over the years. And the Congress, they really recognized that what our job was protecting taxpayer rights. And we didn't care about the political persuasion of that taxpayer. We didn't care about the political persuasion of the member of Congress that was coming to us or the Secretary of the Treasury or anything like that. We were the voice of the taxpayer inside the IRS, and it was an apolitical, non-political job. And I think that was shown by the fact that we had bipartisan support. That legislation that included 21 of our recommendations in this Congress that we have in the United States was a bipartisan bill, maybe one of the only bipartisan bills that we've had in the last few years. But it was a reflection of the taxpayer right, you know, the bipartisan support for the taxpayer rights. On low-income taxpayer clinics, on low-income taxpayers, one of the things that I did before I became the National Taxpayer Advocate is that I was very much aware that in the United States, low-income taxpayers are pulled into the tax system. We have, just like your child care benefit that's administered by the tax agency, we have the largest federal anti-poverty programs administered by the tax agency. We have a refundable credit for the working poor. We have subsidies for health insurance for the poor, the working poor, administered through the tax system. We have a child credit that's refundable, administered, that's means tested, administered through the tax system. And it pulls 26 million low-income taxpayers into the tax system every year to file returns. And they get it wrong because it's a complex law. And one of the things in that 1998 law that why I was called on to testify before Congress was that I had created the first legal aid to represent low-income taxpayers before the IRS in the country. And that my testimony was talking about the problems that low-income taxpayers have because they can't afford representation. And my legal aid, we had recruited volunteer accountants and attorneys to do pro bono representation of taxpayers before the IRS and in the courts so that they could have access to representation and access to justice. And that testimony led to a grant program in the Internal Revenue Code that funds low-income taxpayer clinics throughout the United States. And it's now actually a $13 million grant program. And there are 135 clinics around the United States representing taxpayers. And it has made an incredible difference. Not only do they get representation in audits or in collection matters, but in the courts. And so before the clinics existed, case law was made. The courts were ruling on issues that involved people who could afford representation. The people who couldn't afford representation never got court opinions because they couldn't get before the courts. And now you have a whole body of law dealing with the issues that affect low-income taxpayers, and these taxpayers are represented. And it's a really incredibly important program, and the Taxpayer Advocate Service administers that grant program. So that was just a very important program to be able to get taxpayers free representation when they have disputes with the IRS.
Are there still questions? Mr. Idsinga?
Yes, I still have at least one question. Could you describe a bit more into detail what, if any, was your exact role within resolving tax disputes? Because your neighbor on the right side, Mr. Booij, mentioned tax mediation. What did you have? Were you playing a role in that? And maybe also Mr. Booij could address, I don't know, what could we learn from that from a Dutch perspective going forward? Thank you.
So the IRS has mediation, but they use their appeals officers to conduct mediation, and they don't really push it. So our role would be if we had a taxpayer who came in saying, I think mediation would work in this case, we would be advocating and maybe even having to order the IRS to conduct mediation. We ourselves would not do the mediation. I will say that there were times when we would act as an informal mediator between, for example, someone who is being audited and then the auditor, because the relationship was so difficult and fraught that our intervention helped them communicate better, and I think, but it wasn't a formal mediation role. It was more just trying to help them listen to one another.
Can I add something to it? In the Netherlands, it's technically possible to have mediations, although it doesn't happen that much, and that is mainly because the tax authorities tax inspectors mostly don't like it. They don't want to do it. While some of the conflicts could clearly be better solved by means of at least talking to each other, listening to each other, and perhaps mediation. You need a third person to do this, to help to solve this conflict. It would certainly help if, for example, a task, but it could also be another entity within the Dutch tax authorities that can order more or less the tax inspector to look seriously at the option for mediation in certain cases. We cannot mediate 200,000 cases, but we can mediate 10,000 cases, for example. And that are the best solution if both the tax authorities and the taxpayer together find a solution. And I think we need some support for that. And this might help.
Mr. Idsinga?
One last question. Yeah.
We have still 5 minutes, so the floor is yours.
I started off with asking about the critical success factors that you experienced, but I would like to zoom in a bit further on that. Were there cases whereby you experience, if I had this additional authority or that additional authority, I would have been even more effective in solving issues? Were there any limitations that you encountered? And given the fact that we are able now to set up the system right from the start, well, what could we learn from that?
One thing that I really would have liked to have had is the ability to file an amicus brief in court cases. Not represent the taxpayer, but to come into a court case from the perspective of taxpayer rights. Because sometimes the agency is focusing on this thing and the taxpayer is focusing on this thing, and there's a very important rights issue that will, depending on the ruling, will affect many taxpayers, and no one's bringing that perspective to it. And I never could get Congress to give me that authority, and I really wanted it, which is why I now file amicus briefs in the United States Supreme Court all the time. I did want to mention something about success rate, because I think this is a really good example of how a taxpayer advocate can work and protect taxpayers, and it's relevant to your child benefits situation. In 2003 to 2004, we started getting cases dealing with these benefits that were running through the code, the IRS, where taxpayers' refunds, because these were significant refunds for very low-income taxpayers, were being frozen. And it turned out that the criminal investigation function of the IRS had a fraud detection, artificial intelligence system that was freezing, does that set? Yes, was freezing these returns. And when criminal investigation freezes the returns, the IRS employees on the civil side cannot talk to the taxpayer. They can't tell them anything. They can say, I have no information about your return. And so the taxpayers would call and no one could talk to them. And they would call us, and it became the #1 issue in our inventory. It was about 40% of our case receipts for 2 or 3 years. And we couldn't really tell the taxpayer anything, but they would send us information anyway. And when we would see the information that they were sending us showing that they were eligible for these benefits, we would go over to criminal investigation and say, at least look at this information. And in 80% of the cases, they released the refunds, saying that they were legitimate.
Can you also tell something about the list that they made?
Oh, that's another.
That's another thing, yeah.
That's another one. But the point was that I went to the commissioner and said, these filters are wrong. I went to the chief of criminal investigation saying, you're getting the wrong answers. And their response back to us was, these are fraudsters and we're doing everything right. And for 2 years, I tried to work it inside the building. And then we did a research study that showed the 80% figure. We wrote that up as a most serious problem in our annual report to Congress. We informed Congress. We informed Treasury. Congress, the day after our report was written, 42 senators, bipartisan, wrote the secretary and the commissioner, what are you doing? The National Taxpayer Advocate has identified these things. It was a lead editorial in the New York Times. The commissioner was in South Korea meeting, setting up the first group to deal with offshore evasion, and the secretary called him and said, you get back here right now and you deal with this. Now, it took us 2 years to get that kind of attention. We tried to work it inside the building, but when we felt that we had done every single avenue and taxpayers were being harmed, that program is no longer in criminal investigation. It's on the civil side. We still have issues with the filters, they're not good enough, all of that. But it brought about once we got the attention on it, within 2 months, there was a task force working on that group, and it was revamped completely. And, if we had not been in that building and getting those cases and being able to see what was going on and having those conversations, you know, people would really have continued to be harmed.
I see Mr. de Jong for the last small question. It's like
I can
this,
see
like
you,
this,
Chairman.
is it?
You're right. As you're aware, we're at the start of investigating what the possibilities are here now in Dutch Parliament. Could you say anything about any stakeholders we can't miss in this process, beside the obvious?
I think that what you need to you need to create the structure for this organization, whatever you want it to be. I mean, it's got to fit into your government structure, but you in Parliament need to say, this is what we want for the taxpayers of our country, you know, to help them solve their problems with the IRS. And I think you have to deal with the access to information so that the taxpayer advocates have access to the case information and systemic information so that they can see, they can pull reports and see what's going on to do systemic advocacy. You need to have a reporting function to you, you know, just like I had that annual report, so you can transparently see what's going on and identify the problems at least once a year that's going on. I really think that to make it effective, there has to be some kind of order. It's not just enough to go and say, please look at this. There's got to be a point where you've got an order that elevates it up to the highest levels of the organization so that the highest levels of the organization see what's happening on the ground and can fix it. And I think if you have those tools, you know, then you can figure out whether you want, where you want to put it, you know, and that sort of thing.
We come to the end of this meeting, but I want to thank you, Mrs. Olson, as a former taxpayers advocate, for your inspiring answering these questions. And I saw the MPs, the body language of the MPs. There are a lot of food for thoughts, also for the Dutch Parliament. I think I see the ideas coming up. Thank you very much, Mr. Booij and Mr. de Vries, to visit us in this house. And I will close this meeting.